Good morning. Thank you, David. It's a beautiful song, the greatest command, and that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. And most of y'all know I'm a retired football coach. Yesterday, college football season started. It's my favorite time of year. One thing that a lot of people played football know is not their favorite part of football is two-a-days. And what you're getting today is a two-a-day. Kyle brought you a lesson this morning about love and the love Jesus showed for us. And he made the points about Jesus and how he was obedient to God, how he was selfless, how he sacrificed, and his love was shown. I'm going to make those exact same points again in this lesson. We may repeat some of the same verses, but hopefully it'll help us remember. This is a very, very important topic. In fact, Jesus, not me, calls this the greatest command. The greatest command, to love God and love others. So let's get started. The greatest command, Matthew 22, 36 through 40. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. You know, the first point I want to make here is that all commands are not equal. That's the inference here when Jesus says, this is the great and foremost commandment. You know, a lot of times, you know, in our effort to obey God in everything, we want to try and keep all the commandments, which we need to do. But sometimes in doing that, we get the idea that they all kind of get mashed down, like they're all the same. We want to obey all of them. And we forget sometimes that some are more important than others. And Jesus is making that point right here. I know I need to be reminded of that. This is the most important commandment. And the second one is loving your neighbor as yourself. On these two depend all the law and the prophets. So everything else that we do comes from loving God and loving others. Relational. It sounds simple, doesn't it? In fact, if you were to ask most people in Lindale, do you love God and love others? They'd say, sure. Sure I do. Because our society has a very cheapened view of love. To our society, love is kind of this nebulous feeling of goodwill. And I think you can see from Kyle's lesson this morning, and I hope you see from the lesson we're going to have right now, that love is much, much, much deeper than that. And if we want to be pleasing to God, then I think we need to listen to Jesus when he says this is the greatest commandment. We better be paying attention. And so Kyle referred to 1 John 3:18. Let us not love in word or tongue, but in deed and in truth. A lot of the world, they love in word and tongue. Word only. But John says, let us love in deed and in truth. I think we can all agree that's the kind of love Jesus is talking about in the greatest commandment. In deed and in truth. And that's what we want to look at. So how do we know if we love in word or tongue or in deed and in truth? Well, we got to go to Scripture, don't we? So the first few minutes of this lesson, we're going to cover quickly about 20 scriptures to make our points of exactly what love is, what biblical love is, so we'll know what we're talking about. Firstly, like Kyle said, love is being obedient to God. Let's go through these scriptures right quick. John 14 and 15, if you love me, keep my commandments. Verse 21, he who has my commandments and keeps them is he who loves me. Verse 23, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. Verse 24, he who does not love me does not keep my words. John 15, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. 1 John 5 and 3, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. There's more. This is enough to make our point. Biblical love means being obedient to God in everything. That's number one. Secondly, love is sacrificial. Selfless, rather. Let's look at the love for husband and wife in Ephesians 5:25. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Verse 28, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. So how much did Christ love the church? He gave himself for her. So the love a husband to have for his wife is this same kind of selfless love, the sacrificial love. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. I'm not a wife, but I know it's got to be tough to submit to your husbands a lot of times. Put their will ahead of yours. Again, that's being selfless. 1 Corinthians 7, talking about the physical relationship, do not deprive one another. Again, husbands and wives are to be selfless. Love for the brethren. 1 John 3:16, we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. John 15, 12 and 13, to lay one's life down for his friends. Romans 12 and 10, giving preference to one another. Love for our fellow man. 1 Corinthians 10 and 24. Let no one seek his own, but each the other's well-being. Romans 13, 8 through 10, he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. Luke 6, 27 to 31, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, turn the other cheek. So we can see from all these passages, biblical, scriptural love is selfless, putting others ahead of ourselves. Now we're going to talk about the sacrificial aspect of it. Jesus and God, their love for us was very sacrificial. John 3:16, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Romans 5, 6 through 8, God demonstrates his own love toward us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. 1 John 3:16, by this we know love, because he laid his life down for us. So this biblical love is sacrificial. And lastly, it's always shown. Biblical love is always shown. Love is like the wind. It's hard to define, but it's easy to see in action. We look at all the scriptures we just looked at, 20 scriptures. In every one of them, it describes a love that is shown, a love that can be seen. You know, Chris, maybe a year ago, talked about a book by a guy named Bob Goff. And the book was called Love Does. Love Does. It was a great book. I read it. And it's a lot like Kyle talked about this morning. Faith works in the same way that love does, right? Very similar. When you see people striving to obey God in everything, people that put others' interest ahead of themselves, you see biblical love. So, I know we've gone through this pretty quick, but we wanted to make these points before we move on. And hopefully, we'll remember these. Number one, love is obedient to God in everything. Selfless, always putting others' interest ahead of our own. Sacrificial, even when undeserved. And it's shown by actions, not in word or tongue, but in deed and in truth. So now that we can see what biblical, scriptural love looks like, we have a measuring stick. Now we know what love in deed and in truth is. So the first thing I need to do is I need to think about my relationships and how do I measure up. First of all, my relationship with God. We would all say we love God, but we need to look in the mirror. Do my actions match up with that? Am I striving to put God first in everything in my life? You know, we would say, yes, I love my wife. Well, am I trying to put her needs and her well-being ahead of my own? Yeah, I love my kids. Well, are you making time for prayer and Bible study with them? Are you taking the time it takes to train them up right? I would say, sure, I love my fellow man. But am I giving of my time and my money when someone is in need? Again, love does. It's always shown. And so we need to look in the mirror and see how we measure up. Because remember, this is the greatest command. Love that's not shown is not love at all. Okay. So we got it. We understand what love is. We understand what the greatest command is. Let's all go out this week and love like Jesus. It sounds good, but we've got a problem. And we need to be aware of this problem. We got a fight on our hands. And we're going to be fighting this battle the rest of our life. And we're going to be fighting this battle every day for the rest of our life. Number one, we're going to fight against selfishness. Selfishness. The me monster that resides in all of us. We're carnal, fleshly beings. We're born selfish, and we'll continue to struggle with this self-centeredness as long as we live. You know, a baby is born, and all it knows is what that baby wants. When the baby's hungry, he cries. When he wants diaper change, he cries. And we know we're born that way. It's all about us. Hopefully, as we mature, we learn better. Selflessness is a learned behavior, isn't it? It does not come natural. Selfishness comes natural to us. And we're going to always have this pull to be self-centered. Why is that? You think about it, we've said this before, but you know, we're at the center of every experience we ever had in our whole life. I see life through my own eyes. It seems like the world revolves around me. So we all have this tendency to be self-centered. And we're going to be fighting this our whole life. Daily. So we see we've got selfishness over here, but yet love is selfless over here. Just the opposite. So we've got this gravitational pull that's going to be constantly pulling us to be self-centered and selfish. Now this selfishness, there's three things we want to talk about right quick. It ruins people, destroys families, separates us from God. Let's talk about this first of all. It ruins people because it ruins people physically, because when someone is selfish, they're thinking, I want what I want and I want it now, and I'm not concerned about the consequences later. If it makes me happy now, that's what I'm doing. So people drink alcohol. They use drugs. They destroy their body. They eat too much. They destroy their body that way. People ruin themselves financially because they want what they want right now. And they run up credit card debt, ruin themselves financially. All this is because of selfishness. I want this now. Destroys families and kills relationships. You know, every single marital problem all boils down to one cause, doesn't it? Selfishness. Every fuss husband and wives have is because of selfishness. One or both is putting what they want ahead of what the other one wants or needs. Think about that. All the broken families across the United States, all the pain, all the heartache that comes with that, all boils down to just very simple. People are selfish. You know, I read about this marriage counselor. He had like a 95 or 96% success rate of these married couples that had bad marriages would come to him, and they would wind up with a happy marriage. He had an unbelievable success rate. But the reason his success rate was so high was he only accepted couples that were both committed Christians. That's all he accepted. Because he knew if they're committed Christians, then all he has to do is just say, hey, here's the greatest command. This is what Jesus teaches. We have to be selfless. We have to be sacrificial. And if they're committed Christians, they can put their marriage back together. They'll realize they were being selfish. That's the root cause. Selfishness destroys families, kills relationships. And of course, the third one, it separates us from God. What is every single sin but an act of selfishness? I want to do what I want to do instead of what God would have me do. You know, James says in James 1, we're tempted when we're drawn away by our own desires. You know, you might have heard the old saying, we have met the enemy and he is us. And that's very true. So selfishness is something we're going to be fighting against until the day we die. Impossible to love like Jesus if we're selfish. You know, a little side note here, I always tell young people when they're, you know, old enough to start dating and they're thinking about maybe getting married, if you come across a person that you may be interested in, if they're selfish, you better run away. Quick. You do not want to get involved. I'm glad my wife did not know that when I met her. Man. But luckily, you know, Peter talks about how a godly woman, how she can change her husband by her good conduct without a word. That's the kind of wife I have. Luckily, she was able to change me. But to everybody else, it's not a good, your odds are not good if you marry someone that's selfish. And of course, same goes for you. You can't be selfish and be in a decent marriage or a good relationship. Okay. Our culture is so individualistic. All about self-gratification. Getting what you want. You know, you hear things like, you do you. Do what you feel. Look out for number one. If it feels good, do it. Do what makes you happy. I deserve to be happy. Doesn't God want me to be happy? You know, all this in our culture. And we can't help but be influenced by our culture. We've got to be careful of this. So what does this lead to, this in our culture? This self-gratification, this indulgence. It leads to drug and alcohol abuse, casual sex, pornography, obesity, abortion, laziness, divorce, destruction of the family, all these things. We can go on and on and on. Financial ruin, all these things. So you think it might be important, as a side note here, that we teach our kids, don't let them grow up to be selfish people. Teach our kids that our culture is going to be trying to pull you away to gratify your fleshly desires. You're going to have to fight against that. You know, when I was in the school business, I was around a lot of kids. And, you know, a lot of these kids grow up thinking the world revolves around them. And so self-centered. It's sad. It's very sad. So we need to be teaching our kids. The third thing that we have to fight against, of course, is Satan. Satan is well aware of the first two things, of our selfishness and our culture we live in. He uses them to his advantage. He's the great deceiver. You know, Satan doesn't try to get people to serve him. He doesn't stand up and say, hey, I'm Satan. Why don't you come join me and we'll burn for eternity in hell. He doesn't do that. No, he just wants to encourage people to do what they want to do. We need to realize that. We've got to prepare for Satan's attacks. You know, like I said, I was a coach. We spent hundreds of hours every football season scouting our opponents, trying to know how they're going to attack us, where our weaknesses are, what are they going to do to us, so we can prepare. It's the same way. If we as coaches would do that, trying to win a ball game, how much more important is it for us when our eternal destiny lies in the balance? We need to prepare for Satan's attacks. We need to be ready. He's the great deceiver. Again, he just wants you to do what you want to do. Indulge in your fleshly desires. You know, Satan, along with our culture, says freedom is doing what you want to do. Indulging in your fleshly desires is freedom. Doing what you want is freedom. Jesus, on the other hand, calls that slavery. Jesus calls us, in Matthew 16:24, to deny ourselves. The exact opposite of Satan. Satan wants you to enjoy yourself and give in to all your carnal desires. That's freedom. But Jesus, on the other hand, says, no, that's slavery. You need to deny yourself. There couldn't be a bigger contrast between the two. You know, in the 1970s, most of y'all younger people probably haven't heard of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan had a song and in the 70s, and it said, you're going to have to serve somebody. He said, everybody's got to serve somebody. It may be the devil, and it may be the Lord, but you're going to serve somebody. Some of you older people might remember that song. And Bob Dylan had that exactly right. We're going to serve somebody, either the devil or the Lord. You know, Ephesians 6, where it talks about putting on the armor, getting ready for our battle with Satan. And for years, I would read that, or I would hear a sermon about it, and I would think, okay, I'm studying my Bible, and I'm ready. I've got my armor on. If Satan ever attacks, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be ready. And I thought that for a long time. Finally, it dawned on me, you know, I'm fighting that battle every day. You know, the battlefield is 6 inches long. The space between my ears. This battle goes on every single day with Satan. Here's our daily battle. Am I going to deny self or gratify my flesh? Will I obey God or just do what I want to do? Will I be selfless and sacrificial or selfish? You know, it's easy to see the ones in blue over here. They go with love, the greatest command. Satan would have us do what we want to do on the other side. And this is our daily battle, isn't it? Every single day we answer these questions. Every single day, whether we consciously think about it or not, we fight this daily battle with Satan right here. You know, it doesn't matter. You think about it, get down to the nitty-gritty. It doesn't matter how much you come to church, how often you come to church, how much you read your Bible, how much you pray, how much you do, whatever good things you can think of, doesn't matter if you're not winning these daily battles over here. None of that matters. Because what is this over here? It's the greatest command. It's love. This is what Kyle Dykes read this Wednesday night. Let's read it now. 1 Corinthians, the first few verses of 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak with the tongues of men and angels but do not have love, I've become a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I'm nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Nothing else matters if we don't have love. This kind of love, scriptural love, biblical love. Nothing else we can do matters in the world. That's why this is the greatest commandment. We're going to finish up our lesson talking about the church in Corinth. You know, our daily Bible reading the last couple of weeks has been in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. Chris preached last Sunday about the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians. Kyle Dykes brought his message Wednesday night. He was in 1 Corinthians, talking about the church there. So we're going to talk about it a little more today. The church in Corinth, it was a mess. They were divided into competing factions. Incest was tolerated. They took each other to court. They divided over meat sacrificed to idols. They corrupted the Lord's Supper. Spiritual gifts were misused, and there were other things. What's interesting is Paul's solutions to most of their problems there was the greatest commandment. The greatest commandment was the solution for this. Let's look at that. The fix was unity, selflessness, self-control, self-denial, and love. You might be saying, well, wait a minute. I recognize the selflessness, self-control, self-denial, and love. Unity, we haven't talked about unity as being part of the greatest command. Let's think about this. What is unity? Do we have unity because we all belong to the same church? Or because we're all supposed to believe the same thing? That's not unity at all. In the first place, we don't all believe the same. We don't all have the same opinions. We're individuals. That's believing. If we all believed exactly the same thing, that would be uniformity, not unity. What is unity then? We have unity because we're all people striving to be Christ-like and obey the greatest command. We are one in Christ. We're one because we're all working along the same path to follow Jesus. We're all trying to transform and to be Christ-like. We're all trying to be obedient to God. We're all trying to be selfless. We're all trying to be sacrificial. That's where we get our unity from. That is unity. So when Paul tells them in the early chapters, talking about him being divided, he said, when there's divisions among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men? When you're divided up, that's not unity, We're not being selfless and sacrificial. You're wanting your own way. That's where division comes from. So all unity really is, unity results from Christians obeying the greatest command. In chapter 6, Paul talked about the Corinthians taking one another to court. And he said, why not rather take the wrong? Why not rather allow yourself to be defrauded? Whoever thinks of doing that, he's not going to get away with treating me that way. He's not going to get away with that. That's the way our society and culture thinks. So it's pretty radical for Paul to say, why not just take the wrong? Let it go. How many problems could be avoided if we did that? We usually don't think about that. But again, Paul is trying to get us to obey the greatest command. In chapter 8, where they're talking about the controversy over meat offered to idols. Should we eat it? Should we not? Some thought it was okay. Some thought it wasn't. And Paul said, if it's going to make my brother stumble, I'll never eat meat again. Look at the lengths Paul was going to go to keep the peace, to not have division. I'll never eat meat again. It seems pretty radical to us, doesn't it? This is the greatest command in action. In chapter 9, he talks about he was living a life of self-denial, basically. And at the end of the chapter, he says, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection. Why? Because he knows daily he's fighting the battle against self-centeredness and selfishness. He disciplines his body daily and brings it into subjection. Again, he's trying to follow the greatest command. Chapter 10, let no one seek his own, but each the other's well-being. Chris talked about last Sunday the problems they were having with the Lord's Supper there. And it was a lack of unity. There were divisions, and it was a lack of unity. Lack of love for one another. They weren't obeying the greatest command. Kyle Dykes talked about the chapter 12 Wednesday night. The body having different members and different functions. Again, they needed unity. And then in chapter 13, we know is the great love chapter. We read the first few verses of that. We want to read the next few verses, and this is what we see on posters. We hear this read at weddings a lot of times, and this really defines love. I want you to be thinking about the greatest command and the selflessness that's required here as we read this. Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Well, the lesson is yours. I hope that we all understand now what Jesus meant with the greatest command about love, love for God, love for others. And it's hard, isn't it? It's a struggle daily, the daily struggle. But I hope we understand not only what it is, but how we've got a fight on our hands every day that we live on this earth. Every day we live on this earth, we've got to fight. The battlefield is right here. But the answer to all this, the answer to all of our problems, just like it was for the church in Corinth, is the greatest command. The greatest command. That's why it is the greatest command. So, like the Bob Dylan song, everybody's got to serve somebody. Who are you going to serve? The devil and yourself, or the Lord? If you've not yet made a decision and a commitment to be a child of God, we'd ask you to consider doing that at this time. If we can help you with that, or if you need the prayers of the congregation, or if there's anything else we can do for you, please come forward while together we stand and sing.